Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on X, and on TikTok. Folks, please do tell us where you are viewing from on this great British evening. Please do send in your comments and please do send in your questions because you know that we love to hear from you, the great British viewer. What's been on your mind this week? Well, we've got another packed show for you, and we've titled this one the rather gory title, Starmer Has Blood on His Hands, because many of us are aware that one of the so-called protesters that was so summarily jailed, so quickly put in prison for such a long time, for really doing very little indeed, Mr. Peter Lynch, sadly, apparently took his own life in a prison in Doncaster. So we're going to be touching on that. We'll also be looking at other deaths today in the English Channel. The latest report said that 3 had died in the English Channel crossing over from Calais, and we'll be looking at the history of that, and indeed the British Parliament that refuses to stop this trafficking does indeed also have blood on its hands in that regard. So we're going to be looking at that too. And then at the bottom of the hour, we'll have our On This Day in British History, and we'll also be giving you a prize, which this week is a good prize, a big prize. It's an entire wee book for the Union, which is normally retailing at £5, but will be yours for free if you win our competition. And to win our competition, all you need to do is answer the question that's based around On This Day in British History and send your answer to contact@aforceforgood.uk. There's the address up on the screen there. And you will be in with a good chance of winning if you have not entered this before. I can assure you of that. So let's get as many people entering the competition as well at the bottom of the hour. So what a day, what a week, and what a month this is going to be shaping up to be with the American election as well, just in a matter of days on the 5th of November. And goodness me, this Sunday morning, the clocks go back as well. So we're really racing through this year. At least that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like. Let's say hello to some folk who have come in. Debbie says, hi, everyone. Hope you are all well. Thank you very much. And we got sent a picture today of A Force for Good in action back 5 years ago. Let's bring up that picture, which appears in today's Dundee Courier when A Force for Good was out on Union Street. There we are there, Union Street, Aberdeen. That's us waving our flags while the so-called all under one banner people traipsed by. That was back on the 17th of August 2019. And let's have a look at the figures for that. What did they say they got back then? Yes, they said they had 12,000 people there, but we counted them in at 2,563. That was 5 years ago. Okay. Thanks for sending that picture in. That's in today's Courier. It doesn't mention us in the text, I don't believe, but it does have a nice picture there related to the theme of Scottish membership of the UK. Let's bring that picture up again. What was the heading that it said? SNP gender farce shows why Scotland dodged a bullet with an indie ref no vote. Didn't it just? Didn't it just? Well, let's hope that Keir Starmer doesn't continue on that kind of foolishness. Hi to user 246 on TikTok. Derek says, good evening, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Paul sends his greetings from the Garden of England. And John Smith is viewing from America. Fantastic. Feel free to tell us who you will be voting for if you are voting at the general election, which will be coming up there very shortly. Hi to Catherine, who's in Campsie Glen at the moment, and Daniel from the great British town of Motherwell. Preston Journalist says, Starmer absolutely has blood on his hands. Great show, as always. Now, we've got some news about the Preston Journalist. Ash was our guest last week. He's had a bit of a problem with his YouTube channel, so he has begun a new YouTube channel with a new web address. So if you follow That Preston Journalist on YouTube and you haven't seen him lately, please go to his new channel, which is at youtube.com/@Preston Journalist. youtube.com/@Preston Journalist. That's where you can find Ash at the moment. And please do follow him and subscribe to him at that address. Thank you. Hello to Alan and to Derek and to Joyce from Ayrshire, which is a beautiful county. Hello to Oksana. As Daniel points out, Starmer went on air and told the world he, quote, expected long, hard custodial sentences to be issued to the far-right thugs. His words, and he's accountable for that order going out. And you could say that indeed he shouldn't have done that, because it's not for him to decide the sentences that a judge or a court may dish out. It's indeed for the judge alone to decide. And so it could be argued quite clearly that Keir Starmer did prejudice many of these trials by suggesting the sort of punishment that was due to them. He doesn't do that in any other field, and I can't remember any other prime minister having done such a thing before somebody even goes to trial and before they're even found guilty. A prime minister saying what he expects the sentence to be, that's not good. Preston Journalist says, like him or not, Tommy Robinson could be next. Preston Journalist thinks he will be next. They're going to throw him in Belmarsh. Well, there is, I believe, a big Tommy Robinson gathering this Saturday, the 26th in London, that some people may be going to. So if anybody's going to that, please feel free to mention. Ernesto from Argentina, always happy to have Ernesto in the house. So I hope you're doing well. John Smith is voting Democrat, though liberal values have gone crazy. He says he's not a Trump supporter. Ernesto says that the progressive woke politicians destroy everything they touch. Carl says that Starmer is indeed interfering with separation of powers, the idea that Parliament is meant to be separate from the judiciary. And we got to remember as well that Starmer was a prosecutor. He was the chief prosecutor in England as well. So he knows all these judges, and they know him. And so maybe some of them will know what is expected of them, what they imagine that Keir expects of them. Maybe there's a bit of that as well going on, far too chummy, that whole crew, not properly respecting, as Carl puts it there, the separation of powers, which is meant to be key to our British Constitution. Daniel says, no parliamentary oversight either with his command. It was a vote put. If this was a vote put to the MEPs, would it be acceptable? And Starmer's approval rating does seem to be tanking. So this poor chap, Peter Lynch, 61-year-old, he was given a sentence of 2 years and 8 months altogether. And that's a pretty serious custodial sentence for all he did. And from what we've been able to see and figure out, he didn't commit anything violent. It was just a lot of words that he shouted. I think he shouted scum at the police, and the clips that we've seen just really have him shouting that he's praying for the future of the children. And so nothing that would warrant 2 years, 8 months in jail at all. And he and all the others, they got done, I think, because they were easy targets. They didn't have a legal establishment behind them that was going to be rooting for them. They didn't even really have any politicians who would be rooting for them. And this is completely different from the other side, as it were. Imagine there was a Black Lives Matter rally, and one or two of the people at that got out of hand and they started kicking the perspex things that the police hold, or then they started shouting and swearing in an aggressive manner. And if they got tapped on the shoulder and thrown in the back of the van, there would be an entire legal industry behind them, supporting them, making sure that they were all right, making sure that they got good lawyers. These lawyers would be in touch with the local community so-called organisers, who would be in touch with the local councillors and local MPs. And before you know it, there would be a lot of power put behind the BLM type people who were arrested or who were sitting in prison. And it would just be too much heat, and the charges would be dropped, or they would go to court and they would be found not guilty. And they would also be told to argue that they were not guilty. And so what we had with this situation that erupted in the summer, very briefly, was all these largely young fellows, but also quite a few women there as well, especially some of them on social media, who basically got rounded up. They had no legal establishment behind them. There was no NGOs that would step up for them. And of course, we live in a very politically correct political culture. And so there was absolutely no MPs who were going to step up for them either. And all it took was them to be branded so-called far right. And before you know it, they've pleaded guilty, which really they shouldn't have done. They should have, ideally, if they had the legal muscle behind them, they would have pleaded not guilty. It would have gone to court. The court appearances would have been delayed a few months down the line, and then next year or whenever, when they went to court, they would probably have got a suspended sentence. That's what probably could have happened if they had the legal muscle and the political power behind them. But these poor folk were just absolutely sitting ducks, easy targets, and they all got rounded up, and they all got told to plead guilty, and they got the book thrown at them. And it's a measure of the weakness of our side in many ways, that we don't have a legal establishment that will stand for those sorts of men and women. Think about that. Lawyers are like, well, I don't feel comfortable, defending that particular person politically. It's always been like this, of course, going way back hundreds of years. It's always been like this. The lawyers have to say, well, what side is the state on here? What side is my bread ultimately buttered upon? However, what couple of things that do come out of it is, one, our side, such as it is, needs a legal industry behind us. Lawyers will stand up for us. We also need politicians who can grow a backbone. And in that regard, there's 5 Reform MPs who are better than nothing, it has to be said, and who have been making positive noises in that regard, although still to be stronger noises, still to be strengthened in many ways. Another thing that I would point out is, don't let these sorts of sentences prevent you from peacefully protesting. If you are in some kind of protest situation, my advice to you is, do not confront the police, not even with words. Certainly, of course, you don't confront them with violence, because then you are going down. But if you confront them with words, like cheeky words, that's a danger, okay? Because if they just want to, they can just arrest you. And what we've seen is they can throw the book at you. So don't let this sort of thing put you off peaceful protesting. But if you are at a protest, do not confront the police. Avoid the police. And if the police tell you to do something, just do it for the sake of a quiet life. And if you avoid the police in that manner and you do not confront the police verbally, then you're generally going to be okay. You're generally going to be okay. Not 100% of the time, of course, but generally you are going to be okay if you do not confront the police and you stay away from anything that's involving the police and any kind of emotional situation. Stay away from that. I really do emphasize that. And if a policeman tells you to do something, just do it, okay? That's the best thing to do. But do not let that sort of thing put you off protesting, because you still do have your rights, and you still are able to get your point across. You just don't need to physically confront the police. That's when the errors start happening, and that's when the problems start landing upon your head. So that would be my advice. But God bless poor old Peter Lynch and his family, because the man literally did nothing wrong. He did nothing wrong at all. And indeed, he's a hero to the extent that he stood up there and he prayed for the children, and he put himself forward saying that we need to have a future for our children, and we cannot have this mass immigration, infinity immigration invasion that we have at the moment, which is putting us all into danger. I was thinking about that earlier. I'm writing a book at the moment, as many of you know, which is going to be volume 2 of a big book for the Union, and it's going to be about Britain's borders. And I often see people talking about the importance of social cohesion, and that's certainly true. You certainly do want integration. If you're going to have immigration, you do want integration. However, that can only ever go so far. The social cohesion thing can only ever go so far. What's rapidly taken over now is just public safety. Okay, we want to be safe in our countries. We want to be safe. So public safety is really one of the bigger issues now, almost even more so than like integration. It's like, how safe are we going to be? I'll develop that thought in greater depth in our volume 2, which will be out before Christmas. We're going to make sure it's out before Christmas, but it's really going to be a fantastic volume. A fantastic volume. You can get volume 1, of course, One Big Country, by going to amazon.co.uk and simply searching for One Big Country. So, talking about the immigration situation, there were 3 boat people who drowned today in the English Channel, told that they drowned 2 miles out from Sandgate, so that's out from Calais. And so the rest of the people that were in the water were rescued and taken back to Calais. And the public prosecutor in Calais has opened a file on the matter. And that's actually a very important point to consider, because if you are in an oversized dinghy and you're flying out around, say, the shores of the UK, if you're a British citizen and you're out for the day and your dinghy's oversized, or if you're cruising on a loch in Scotland or something like that, and it capsizes due to the weight, the police are going to be interested. The public prosecutor is going to be interested. They're going to know, what's that about? Who's culpable? Who was culpable for the drowning of these people in the loch in Scotland, or in the motorboat that capsized off the shore of Dover or whatever? The public prosecutor will be interested. And so surely the public prosecutor in Britain should be interested when we bring in a group of people who have capsized their own boat, accidentally, presumably, and where people have drowned. I mean, that's a legal matter. People have died. And so the public prosecutor in Britain should be taking everybody who was on that boat, locking them up, finding what happened, and prosecuting the people who were guilty for controlling that motorboat and overloading it and resulting in it capsizing and killing people. I've never heard that angle before. I've never heard that said. Does that happen? Does that happen when the RNLI bring in a group of people that they've literally plucked out of the sea? Do we press charges on these people? Because we should. We should immediately detain them. We should keep them detained, and we should rush through the court case as fast as possible, and people should be going to jail. Or are these people just regarded as innocent, and they're just put through the system as normal and consequently forgotten about? Okay, so that's something that we need to be developing and promoting as well. But I found this article today. I thought it was suitable. Asylum crisis, all UK's fault. Benefits culture to blame, claims Mayor of Calais. Now, guess what? You look at the title, the date, Tuesday, April the 21st, 2009. Okay, we've had this in our detailed files, along with many other such cuttings. This is over 15 years old. Asylum crisis, all UK's fault. Benefits culture to blame, claims the Mayor of Calais. 15 years ago. What has been done about this since? So on the same day, in the Daily Telegraph, 21st of April 2009, Calais blames British benefits system for its migrants crisis. The mayor of Calais has blamed Britain's asylum and benefit system for imposing thousands of illegal migrants on her town. Natasha Bouchard demanded that millions be paid in compensation and said Britain was entirely to blame for the hordes of foreigners who used the French port as a staging point to get across the Channel. Mrs. Bouchard said she was so disgusted by what was going on that she had refused to meet British government representatives. Quote, "I've received many demands for a meeting. I've never followed them up because I consider them provocative. To receive a representative of the British government is to support what it imposes on us." Close quote. Now, remember, this is 15 years ago. Mrs. Bouchard said the Calais Chamber of Trade had to spend 12 million a year securing the port area, money she suggested the French government should pay back to her Chamber of Trade. But it was Britain's immigration system which was predominantly to blame for thousands of Africans, Eastern Europeans, and Asians trying to clamber aboard lorries and trains in Calais every day to get to Britain. Quote, she says, "Requesting asylum is easier with the British than in France. The asylum seeker is given accommodation and receives £31 to £40 a week." Remember, this is 15 years ago. When the annual salary of the average Eritrean is 136 quid, that seems enormous and it's attractive. Calling for a change in attitude, she said the build-up of foreigners was unsustainable. About 2,000 British-bound migrants are sleeping rough in the area. She says Calais is a hostage to the British. That's no longer tenable. We're not here to do their job. Calais blames British benefits system for its migrants crisis. 15 years ago, and it's still going on. Nothing has been done to physically stop it. 15 years. Shocking, utterly shocking. Our useless, utterly useless British politicians. We wrote an article which we'll put out called "Yes, We Can Turn Back the Boats." Let me share that screen for you. Yes, we can turn back the boats. And in it, we laid out the principles. You close the door if you want to beat the gangs. And importantly, you stop them landing on our shores. We must do everything we can to keep these people off our shores in the first place, because once they are on our shores, then like it or not, they do become our responsibility, in the sense that we can't just let them starve and wander about homeless, because that would create all sorts of additional problems. So we have to remove their incentives to cross, and that's where the policies come in. And we've got 5 policies there. Basically, if you come over on a small boat, you will absolutely be denied the right to claim asylum. If you have no documents, you will be imprisoned, literally in a prison, until such time as you remember where you came from. If you have documents, you will be sent back to your home country forthwith. And countries, people always say, well, Alistair, what happens if they can't, if the countries won't take them back? You know, what do you do in a situation like that? Well, we can make it worthwhile for countries to take them back. For example, we could cut their foreign aid if they don't take them back, and we could impose restrictions or outright bans on their people coming to this country on work visas, or even on tourist visas, or on student visas. And we could also declare many more countries safe, such as we could declare Vietnam, Turkey, and Brazil safe. to enable faster deportation. Ideally, we should process them offshore in a foreign country with whom we have an agreement. And very importantly, if they are granted refugee status, it should only be a temporary status. The understanding should be here that they're only here for as long as it takes for their country to be safe again, and that their refugee status is not a pathway to citizenship. Because a lot of these guys coming over on the small boats know that if they get refugee status, then all they have to do is hang about for 5 years and then apply for British citizenship. And so it should be a law that if you are granted refugee status, that never gives you a pathway to citizenship, and you will be expected to go home eventually. We should encourage these who are already here to go home with resettlement and accommodation grants. And we should physically turn back the boats. And we detail here how that can be done. Because all that is lacking is the political will. And if we do that, we will save lives. We'll save lives not only in the Channel, but we'll save lives in the Atlantic as well, because a lot of these, and the Mediterranean, because there's lots of people drowning in the Atlantic, trying to get to the Canary Islands, trying to get to Spain, trying to get to Calais, trying to get to Britain, and would save lives also in the Mediterranean. So do check out that article. We lay it all together, and no doubt we'll also publish that article in our book as well on the matter. So we can stop the boats. It's just that, and we can stop mass immigration, and we can send them back, and we can ensure no resettlement in Scotland or the rest of the United Kingdom. It just takes the political will. And we have to stop getting confused with the morality of all of this, because this is where people really get brought down. Is most people have a very tenuous grasp of morality at the best of times. And if some wicked politician comes to you and says, you'll be a good person if you go along with this, and so you get all these people thinking that it's our moral duty to help these people coming over on small boats. Well, if there was one person coming over on a small boat, then it might be your moral duty to make sure that he's okay. But when there's hundreds a day, then the context and the circumstances change, and they require you to have a moral duty to other people, a moral duty to your own people in your own country. Okay, so moral duties often depend upon circumstances. And while one is compelled by the Christian faith to love everybody, that still doesn't mean that you ignore the circumstances of the moment, which may compel you to have a stronger moral duty for something else, such as your own people, your own village, your own town, your own country. And of course, this is the moral conundrum that we all face at wartime as well. So do not be confused by the false morality that gets put upon you and gets put upon us to try to force us into doing things that at the end of the day will actually be immoral for ourselves or for our country. Having said that, let's talk about our country on this day in British history. Now, folks, later in the programme, I'll ask you a question about on this day in British history, and the winner will get this, a wee book for the Union worth £5. Okay, this is the book that they were all talking about when it came out, a very succinct summary of our great British Union. Lots of good ideas in here of how to stand up and argue for the UK. So you will send your answers to contact at A Force for Good. Anyway, on this day in British history, on this day in British history, 23rd of October 1707 was the very first time that the British Parliament ever sat. Hitherto, of course, prior to the 1st of May 1707, there was an English Parliament and there was a separate Scottish Parliament. And it was the union of parliaments, 1st of May 1707. And the Treaty of Union, which said, quote, that the United Kingdom of Great Britain be represented by one and the same Parliament to be styled the Parliament of Great Britain. And it was on this day, 23rd of October, that it first sat. And it looked a little bit different from what it looks like now. Let's put up a picture of it. There was no, there it is there. There it is there. So there's the front facing bit, and then the sloping roof in the background is the only bit that's still standing today. That's called Westminster Hall. That's that big, anybody that's been in the Houses of Parliament, as you go in on your left, there's this big, usually empty chamber. That's the hall, and it's still standing today. Now, these houses down in the corner, they've all been demolished. And so the Parliament looks, the Parliament that we know today was built between 1840 and 1870. Let's put up the next picture. So that's the Parliament we know today. Now you can see that building with the sloping roof, that's still standing. So the rest of the Parliament was built around that. Here's another angle from it. There it is. You see that sloping roof. Let's go back to the old picture. There you go. You can see the Westminster Hall, that big building with a sloping roof. That's still standing. However, there is another building that does appear to still be standing. See that picture there? Down on the left-hand corner, there's another building with a sloped roof. Let's focus in on that. There you go. See what I mean? That building there with the sloping roof. That's still standing as well, because let's go to the next picture. There it is there. Let's go back. And forward. There you go. So that little structure is still standing, but along with the big hall. But other than that, it's all new build. Okay. So that was today. And back then, there was no such thing as a prime minister. There was simply a speaker. And the Speaker of the Parliament was John Smith, the Whig MP for Andover, elected the first Speaker of the House of Commons of Great Britain. And at that time, there were 45 MPs from Scotland out of a total of 558 MPs, meaning that the Scottish representation was 8%. And today, there's 57 Scottish MPs out of 650, meaning that the Scottish representation is 9%. So basically the same amount of representation as we had back in 1707. Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, let's look at some of your comments, and we'll ask a question about that in a minute. Eric says Facebook has just censored your comment. Very possibly. It censors certain words. Ernesto says, long live the king. Daniel Thomas says, schools expel children for back chat, but we can't send the boats back. Catherine says, why should we have them if their own country won't have them? Good point. What does this button do? Says that the boats were lured in the first place, and it's like locking the stable door after the horse has bolted. Well, let's hope that people say, well, Alistair, Starmer's not going to do anything. Possibly so, but what we can do in the interim is to normalize this conversation. Okay, normalizing all these sorts of stuff. We can do that. We can normalize it so that in the next time round, or rather that we're just generally radicalizing people to these necessities, so that when we have another big political moment where we're voting, there'll be sufficient numbers of people to put pressure on the political class to get something done. And these moments are happening all the time at council elections, Scottish elections, Welsh elections, Northern Irish elections. There's Scottish council elections. There's three council elections in Glasgow on the 21st of November, and I think Reform are standing in all of them. And so, if you're in any of those constituencies and you think that this is an issue, then you've got a party to vote for that does want to stop mass immigration. So there's always opportunities for you to vote on this particular matter and get your voice heard. So we can normalize the conversation and we can vote for parties that support what we support. That's the kind of best that we can do in a democracy, as well as peacefully protest when the opportunities arise, which also helps to normalize the conversation. As Alan quite rightly points out, lawfare has destroyed our country. It's the biggest threat we face, and no one is doing anything to remedy it, as too many factions are using it for their own gains. Well, absolutely. And the asylum and immigration legal industry is massive, and any political party that wanted to stop mass immigration and bogus asylum would immediately stop legal aid for any asylum or immigration case. You would put so many of those lawyers out of work, and ultimately there would be no work for them anyway. So the lawyers are very much part of what's ticking this process over. Absolutely. It's a multi-headed hydra, and you need to be defunding the NGOs. You need to be defunding the asylum and immigration industry. I always talk about how ridiculous it is that when Rishi Sunak was arguing for the Rwanda policy, the British government itself was funding NGOs which themselves were arguing against the Rwanda policy. So obviously nothing's going to happen. Obviously you're going to lose. If you're literally paying your enemies or your opponents with your money to argue against you, then you're not going to win. You're just a sucker. There's a girl that I don't know of, but she does a lot of good work called let me just check. You should check her out on Twitter. No, I can't find her at the moment. But more people are more people are. No. More people are waking up to this. It really has to be done. It has to be done. Adam says, we can control the borders of our own house, but not our own country. The border is a door and we've left it open, and the woke courts say we can't lock the door. Yep. All 59 says the Home Office is compromised. There's certainly a lot of people in the Home Office who want open borders. Well, that's certainly true. Stephen says more people have arrived and stayed in this country post 1945 than during our entire previous history. Certainly post 45, probably more like post 97, actually. Although don't quote me on that, but I'll have the details. I'll have the details somewhere. Talking of which, this article got our attention. Slowest rise in living standards in 50 years. That's from the Daily Telegraph of the 19th of October 2024. Real gross domestic product per head up just 0.3% a year this decade. That's the 2020s. As surge in migration weighs on the economy. The journalist writes here, figures from the Office for National Statistics show that real GDP per head, which is often described as a measure of average living standards, is growing at the slowest rate in decades. Okay, so we've got to have all this mass immigration because it's good for the economy. But when you actually work it out, the government's own department, the Office for National Statistics, says that average living standards are actually growing at the slowest rate in decades. It has increased by only 0.3% a year on average so far in the 2020s. This is much lower than in any previous decade since at least the 1970s. Here we go. GDP per head has slowed as the population has grown faster than the economy. And it goes on to say that net migration added 1.5 million to the population in 2022 and 2023 combined. Well, that's net migration. But in each of those years, the gross immigration, before you subtract the emigration, the gross immigration in each of these years was over 1.2 million in each of those years. 2.4, over 2.4, almost 2.5 million people in 2022 and 2023. And I think they all moved into my neighborhood. And all tried to squeeze onto my bus as well. I just want to talk about that, actually, about GDP, gross domestic product, because that's a very important point that has just been brought out there. We wrote an article, published it yesterday, called Nothing to Show for Mass Immigration. Nothing economic to show for mass immigration. Let me share the screen. There you go. Economy has nothing to show for mass immigration. And in this article, we'll send out the links in the threads, but really suggest that you have a look at it. It explains what GDP is and what GDP per head is. Very simple terms. And we use the International Monetary Fund definitions, and we show that basically as immigration has increased, so the actual benefit per head of each person has decreased. And I will just bring up here this table, which appears in the article. And you see there that, like in the 1980s, really before the heavy numbers of mass immigration came in, the gross domestic product was rising at 2.6% on average during that decade. And the per head benefit was rising at 2.5%. And then once the 2010s kicked in, it all started to really diminish to the point where so far in the 4 years of the 2020s, real GDP is rising at only 1.1%, and GDP per head at a minuscule, basically stagnant 0.3%. To say basically that GDP is doing, immigration rather, is doing nothing for the gross domestic product. And I want to just take you through an article here which I discovered, which helps to explain all of this. Let me bring it up. The link between growth and immigration, unpicking the confusion. This is an excellent, easily read little article which really helps to explain things. It's from the London School of Economics, and it's from Professor Alan Manning, who was the chairman of the Migration Advisory Committee, which is an independent body that advises the government. And he's taking a very fair look at the question of GDP. And he's pointing out the realities, the sort of realities that I just mentioned there. He says, but on the relationship between immigration and growth, I think much comment is deeply confused. The root of the confusion is what we mean by growth. Growth might mean an increase in gross domestic product, the total amount of goods and services produced in the economy. Because immigration means more people, and more people means a bigger economy, immigration almost certainly increases growth in this sense. But we normally think of growth as being desirable because it represents an improvement in the material standard of living. Then GDP per capita, which is to say per person, is a much better measure of growth, and the relationship between immigration and growth more complicated, as immigration raises GDP but also raises the capita bit of the formula, by which he means it increases the number of people living here. And then he does some very interesting examples. Before the pandemic disrupted the economy, UK GDP per capita was 33,700. An extra immigrant will raise GDP per capita if their contribution is above this figure, and they will reduce it if it is below. Now, that's important. And as he points out, therefore, using this measure, immigration is no longer necessarily pro-growth because it depends. It depends on the earning power of the immigrant. Assessing the contribution of migrants to GDP is critical to deciding whether more open immigration rules raise or reduce GDP per capita. And he continues that one contribution of immigration to GDP is the earnings of the migrants themselves, but their work also generates profits. So labour income, by which he means the earnings of the actual person, is about 60% of the total GDP income, meaning that 60p in earnings generates £1 in GDP on average. Therefore, if a migrant's earnings generate the same profit per pound as the average, this would mean that any single migrant earning above 20k would raise GDP per capita. Now, what he means by that is if you earn just over 20,000, then in total you generate just over 33,000 in the wider economy for the GDP figure, which is around what would be needed to keep the GDP per capita figure stable or slightly increasing at the assumed 33,700 up here. Then he goes on, but if the migrant has a non-working partner and child, they would have to earn over 60,000 to raise GDP per capita. Therefore, rules on rights to bring dependents, which are rarely discussed, make a big difference for the impact of immigration on GDP per capita. So immigration itself isn't going to automatically raise GDP per capita. It depends how much is that immigrant going to earn, and does that immigrant have dependents? And if they have dependents, then they're going to have to earn an awful lot, way more than the average salary. They're going to have to earn at least 60k if they're going to benefit the economy in any way. Well, how many people do you know that earn 60k a year, let alone immigrants? He also speaks about the settlement rules here. The effects of migration on GDP per capita may be more positive in the short run than in the long run, because initially the migrants are on work permits and they have to work. But if they settle, some will end up out of work just like everyone else and will eventually retire. So settlement rules, again rarely discussed, matter for the impact of immigration on growth. And then he concludes at the bottom here. He concludes, the bottom line from his report, which he offered to the government, was that the impact of a well-chosen immigration policy on growth, economic growth, was very small unless one focused on total GDP, which is the wrong measure anyway. For high-skilled immigrants, it is likely that GDP per capita is raised, but for lower-skilled immigrants, it is much more debatable. And he points out something that's so important. A lot of the current discussion is about reducing restrictions on immigration to address labour shortages in sectors like agriculture and hospitality, where productivity and salaries are low. So there's so much to consider as far as GDP is concerned, including the income of the immigrants, how long they're going to be here for, and indeed what sectors that they're going to be in, and whether they have dependents or not. Now, the question for this little book, A Wee Book for the Union. Send your answers, folks, to contact@aforceforgood.uk. On this day, which Parliament sat for the first time in 1707? I should have given that question a lot earlier. I'm sorry, folks. My head is so, I don't have a teleprompter here. So it's all just in various compartments of my brain. Let's look at a few comments, and then hopefully somebody will have won the competition. as Stephen points out, importing economically inactive benefit recipients hurts GDP, hurts it in a big way. Basically, the GDP per head is stagnant now and has been for several years. There's literally no benefit, no economic benefit whatsoever. We haven't got round to talking about the Chagos Islands. We've got a British Indian Ocean flag. Maybe when it comes up again, we'll speak about that. However, I see that Eric has got a point of view on the matter. Let's read out Eric's. Where is it? In my view, Parliament should have scrutinised the deal before any agreement. There's a lot at stake. For example, the islands are part of the marine protection zone, which protects the ecosystems of these islands. Yes, in a big way, and it's a kind of world-leading eco-zone that the British have got there. The islanders were evicted and didn't have a say in the agreement. Mauritius has pivoted towards China. It would be an issue. It wouldn't be an issue if they were under the sphere of India. Yes. This is... Folks, I don't think we've got a winner. That was my fault. That was my fault. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Catherine says you need a longer show or twice weekly. Oh, well, I'm afraid that's going to require a much bigger team if we're going to do a twice weekly show, and it would need people writing stuff. Ideally, we'd like to do that, though. Ideally, it'd be good if we could broadcast every night. But at the moment, we're working within the capacity that we've got to produce a weekly show. But I'm glad that you like the idea and would like us to do more, Catherine. That would be great. Good stuff. Okay, folks, we will be back next week. We're hoping we'll have a guest next week. In the meantime, please go to Amazon and please get your copy of One Big Country, a big book for the Union, Volume 1. Just search for One Big Country. It's our merchandise that help us to keep going. It's our merchandise which helps this operation keep going. You can also go to our shop at forceforgood.uk/shop-1, and you can get our wee book as well. Let's get rid of that banner. There we go. A wee book for the Union at our shop. As well as our new WW1 Greeting Cards. Is your home here? Defend it. Goodness me, we need that sentiment back. And this Scotland Now, a warning to the world. Great stuff. Okay, folks, we'll be back next week. Thank you very much for watching. We've got 350 people watching at the moment, but it's time to say goodbye and to bid you a good night and to say God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next week.